I started my graduate work in computer science at the University of Maine, I was just grading homeworks, and I was sitting there and I realized, I'm bored. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that made a contribution of some kind. That's when I met this guy. James Wilson. He's an economist who works for the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine, and he studies fisheries, why they collapse, and why sometimes they don't. Now, when everyone hears about a collapsing fishery, the first thing they think is, just don't fish so much. It's simple. But it's not. Submitted for your approval today, green sea urchin, Strongylocentrotus droebachiensis. It's a beautiful creature. It's almost spherical. It has no brain, but it can make decisions. It can go toward food and away from predators, only really slow predators. This thing it's found all over the world. I picked up this one in Hawaii off the Big Island scuba diving. It's just the shell, but it looks pretty much the same. And this one, which I have here, you can come up and see it afterwards if you want, is from Morocco, and it's 5 million years old. Think about how much we've changed in 5 million years. We look like the bonobos monkeys and the chimps. This looks pretty much the same. This one basic design has worked all over the world and for millions of years until now. You see, someone figured out that they're yummy. About 1985, Japanese buyers started showing up and buying them, kind of like we have the initial stages of our Elver industry right now. It was like that in the mid-'80s. If you crack an urchin open, you see this. Doesn't that look yummy? You take one slice, and it feels like a slice of old overripe pear. And it tastes like seawater that you left out a little bit too long. But people love them. It's called uni. You can get it at any sushi restaurant, but in Japan you can get it in every grocery store. So we started fishing them like crazy. Everybody got into the business, and we got really good at it. After only 10 years, though, the urchin fishery was already in demise. It was already hit its peak, over its peak, and on its way down. In a panic, we had to figure out something. So we tightened regulation. We set more restrictions. In parts of the Gulf of Maine, the fishing season went down to only 10 days a year. You can't make a business on 10 days a year. We're thinking about this thing all wrong. Jim Wilson has thought of another way to envision fisheries, and I think it has applications to any common pool resource in the world. Jim Wilson studies complexity science in complex systems. Now, this is not the same as something that's complicated. Now, the urchin fishery, it's kind of complicated. I mean, there's urchins all over, and you can never wrap your head around exactly where they all are at any given time. But no, complexity is when you have something simple, but when you get enough of them together, beautiful patterns emerge. Think about a set of things, and each one of them only interacts locally. It doesn't know the big picture. It has simple rules that we can understand. We can wrap our head around that one little thing and its interactions. But you get enough of them together, and patterns emerge. Think about starlings. I love this bird. It's pretty. It's got all the normal birdie things going on. It's got a beak. It's got wings. It's got 2 eyes. But the interesting stuff happens when you get them together. See, they're always watching each other, and their brains are just tuned to be in tune with each other, where they're going, what they're doing. And when you get a lot of them together, that's when the magic happens. These patterns form spontaneously. No single bird knows what they're going to make. An ornithologist would tell you that this helps these birds escape predation. You see a falcon or a hawk comes into this, and they see birds everywhere, but they can't get a beat on any individual one. Shocking patterns sometimes. I'll let you interpret that one for yourself. And that's for all the lovers out there. So, we see complexity all over the place. But you got to understand what's going on in these birds' minds. Let's get into the mind of one of these birds. 3 simple rules are enough to explain all of that beautiful behavior. Rule 1, point the same direction as your nearest neighbors. Don't get too far from the group. And don't get too close to any single individual. If you program all this into a simulation, you will spontaneously get the beautiful patterns that we see in real life. If you look at this again, can't you see some of those rules taking place here? These birds, the ones, they're all following trajectories somewhat similar to the birds nearest them. How about ants? That's my drawing of an ant. I know it's not very good. But ants have complexity too. An ant finds food, what does it do next? Well, she leaves a pheromone trail for her friends as she goes back to the colony. Another ant finds it and then makes the trail even stronger. Ants use pheromones to coordinate their efforts on raising the young, on fighting wars, on building their colonies, and of course foraging for food. Ants use pheromones, birds use visual communication. Each one of them, if you look at a single ant, you can understand that. But an entire ant colony is a lot to keep in your head at one time. It's a lot to understand. Well, let's bring this back to urchins. How can this solve our urchin problem? Well, what are we doing now for urchins? We use population equations. These are used to model how many deer we have here in Maine. And it's used to model all kinds of species. The typical population equation has a factor for birth rate, another factor for carrying capacity, which is how many of this species can an environment support. And some of them even have predators in there. But one thing they're all lacking is structure. Years ago, more than 30 years ago, James Wilson started to realize that this fine-scale structure was absent from our studies of these animals. Just the number was all we were looking at. But tell me this, let's say right here we had an anthill with about 1 million ants in it. And right here, I dug a hole with a shovel. And then in that hole, I dumped a pile of 1 million ants. Are these two things really the same? Does one of them have a better chance of survival? We can't just look at the number of things. This is a computer simulation that I've been working on for the last 3 years. What you're looking at is a small patch of the Gulf of Maine, about 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. And each single pixel is about 20 meters by 20 meters. White is land, gray is water. The darker the gray means the deeper the water. The green is seaweed. That's what the urchins eat. We also call it kelp. The red are the sea urchins. Now, since it's 20 meters by 20 meters, a single pixel might have hundreds of urchins of all different sizes in it. Every single day goes by in less than a second. You see them moving around. This is what things looked like before the urchin fishery began. You'll notice that there's huge areas which are just gray. That's the urchin barren. They call it a barren because the seaweed has been all eaten down, all mowed. It's hard to keep it that way. You can't see it, but there are urchins in subtle aggregations, too subtle to see. They're always moving around, eating that, keeping it down. Most importantly, though, those are the mature urchins, the ones that can really eat a lot. The smaller urchins are unable to eat the seaweed that fast, but they enjoy the safety of the barren. Well, how can a barren be safe? Well, those smaller urchins, they have predators like the Jonah crab. that don't like being out in the open because they're afraid of getting eaten themselves. So they stay away from the barren, thus leaving the smaller urchins alone. It's like a safe haven for them. Now let's jump forward to 1985 when the urchin fishery began. And I want you to keep your eyes on the urchins in the middle. A fishing event is occurring right now. Those urchins are disappearing. What I let these fishermen, these simulated fishermen do is come back every 2 weeks for just 1 year. That's heavy fishing. But I wanted to see if after just 1 year of harvesting like that, what happens when we let the site just be alone on its own? Will it recover from a year of fishing like this? And during this year, these fishermen extract 127,000 urchins from this site. So we're going to jump forward to 3 years from now. That's 1 year of fishing and 2 years of no fishing. Sadly, this site did not come back. There's one tiny enclave of urchins over there on the right hanging on for dear life. I feel bad for those guys. This goose is not laying any more golden eggs. Sadly, this is how much of the Gulf of Maine is right now. So what can we do about it? Well, let's get in the mind of a diver. We got into the mind of a bird, then an ant. Now how about a diver? Well, a diver chooses a random spot at a fishing site like the one we saw. And then they just randomly swim around until they've run out of urchins or they've run out of air. Well, these past few years, I've done a lot of thinking and meditating on patterns. The patterns of the starlings and the ants and all these other things. Well, what if the diver swam in a pattern? It was just a silly idea I had one day. Let's try a circular pattern because it was easy to program. But most importantly, there are blank spaces in between each circle. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about and what it looks like, I'm amping up the urchins just so you can see them all. Brighter red than they would usually be. But there's going to be a fishing event in a second, and you'll see that the person harvested urchins along those circles. See that? Leaving other urchins untouched. Another fishing event is about to happen. It's a virtual 2 weeks later, and you will notice that the nature of circles, if you start at a different spot, creates interference. See that? So there are a number of locations spread out all throughout the site that are left untouched even after multiple events. But most importantly, the urchins have time to redistribute themselves in between any two fishing events. Therefore, the urchin barren is maintained, the seaweed doesn't grow back, those predators don't move back in, and the younger urchins are kept safe. At the end of that first fishing year, well actually, let's get in our DeLoreans and go back to 1985. This is the same simulation we saw before. Keep your eyes in the middle. Those urchins will start to be harvested, but what's too subtle to see here is that they're using the circular harvesting method. And during this year, they extract 124,000 urchins. That's almost the same amount in just 1 year. But the results are totally different. At the end of the year of fishing, it looks kind of like the other one, but what you don't know is that these few urchin aggregations are actually very healthy. There are other factors in the computer model that study the health of these urchins. And if we let it rest like we did for 2 years, so we're not going to fish anymore for 2 years, it looks like this. They've totally come back. This is sustainable fishing. I brought this to a few people, and what they first tell me is, it's not realistic. Divers aren't going to swim in circles. Well, okay, I know that, but what can we do? This is just a computer simulation. It's not reality, but it did lead me in new directions, make me think of things I'd never thought of before. Maybe we can solve the urchin fisheries problem without making more restrictive licenses and regulations. Maybe we just need to fish differently. And if circles aren't the answer, maybe something else, anything that will leave mature urchins distributed over these sites. Now, I've talked about urchins, but this kind of thinking, the whole complex systems field, applies to any common pool resource. anytime you have a bunch of people or a bunch of things, and you can't put the whole thing in your head at once, but you have to come up with ways for us to cooperate. Stephen Hawking said, this century will be the century of complexity. Complexity science is going to touch all of your lives. And it led me to simplicity on the other side, and even a lesson that we can learn from the urchins. You see, these urchins cannot survive unless they're in a group, but a specific kind of group. A group where the older urchins help create an environment where the youth could thrive. Thank you.